Hello, my name's Helen Lentell. I'm the Fellow in Distance Learning at the University of Leicester in the United Kingdom. And I'm here in Vancouver at the Commonwealth of Learning, working with Cole on a project on leadership and management in distance learning. And today we're fortunate enough to be joined by Dominique Abrioux, who is the past president of Athabasca University, the kind of open university of Canada. Welcome.
Thank you.
Dominic, can you describe what your role entailed as the president?
When I was appointed president of Athabasca University, the institution was in a state of crisis. There had been no growth in student numbers for 10 years. It was the most expensive provincially run university in the system. We had the lowest graduation rates. The government that was in a period of cutbacks had announced a 21% rollback in government grants across all institutions over the next 3 years, but in the case of Athabasca University, a 31% cutback in government grants. The university was at risk either of being closed or of being appended to another institution, and the board was informed by the minister at the time of making an appointment in 1995 that this was really the last chance for Athabasca University. Understandably, internal morale was at a dangerously low level where people were working for themselves and trying to prepare themselves in order to wherever the next career step might take them. This was not this situation was not contrary to what was happening in the rest of Canada insofar as single mode open distance learning institutions is concerned, because the other two leaders in Canada were experiencing very similar problems, and there was a common concern that increased competition from dual mode institutions would render the future of ODL institutions perhaps superfluous. I saw four principal roles as president when first hired. The first one was to significantly improve the relationship with government, because Athabasca University in fact was doing much better than what government believed, but they weren't getting the message. Part of the involvement with government and the need to focus on relationship with government was also to ensure that they understood how relevant and indispensable Athabasca University was to the province. And in order to do this, the role involved serving more provincial students, collaborating with other providers, and becoming a national leader in open distance learning without taking away from the provincial mandate, because we were provincially funded. Cost efficiencies had to be improved through significant growth in student numbers and graduation rates. And in order to do this, clearly, it flowed that the second role as president was to turn around the morale and the productivity of the internal staff. This involved building a strong leadership team, in fact replacing almost all senior appointments in the university during the first 6 months, leading by example and ensuring that the values that the university espoused or claimed to espouse were what drove me as president and were seen to be driving me as president, and to devise an administrative organizational structure that would facilitate this transformation of the university. And that, for example, in one of the first actions that I took was to eliminate the faculty structure. I should say, to have the faculty agree to have the faculty structure eliminated. And in order to position Athabasca for the future, and in fact for the very, very near future, the university had to change completely from being print and telephone based to being primarily online. At the same time, as president, my third role was to provide strategic direction for the institution, and that through the development of very strong strategic plans which were unequivocal in where the university was going how it would measure its own success, and how it committed to reporting on its achievements. In fact, one of the best decisions I personally made on an operational level was my selection of our Vice President Academic at that time. And he subsequently admitted to me that one of the primary reasons he came was that he read and understood the Strategic University Plan. It was a match. Lastly, it was critical to build interinstitutional support for Athabasca University. So that was my fourth primary role. And that entailed maximizing the rapport with the other post-secondary institutions in the province in order that they would better understand what we were doing, and they would help us with government to ensure that the needs of the kinds of learners we served were being served, and that Athabasca was being recognized. It was, in some ways, it was a difficult task, because they were rapidly becoming our competition. But we had to work with them to make them better at it, because that was part of our role as a single mode distance learning institution in the province. At the national level, because in a country like with the demographics such as Canada has, in order to gain economies of scale, you have to go outside the province. One of the primary collaborative initiatives that we engaged in was the establishment of the Canadian Virtual University, which brought together initially, I believe, about 12 or 13 organizations or faculties from traditional universities that were engaged in distance learning, and created a consortium which exists to this day. And internationally as well, one of the key components was to achieve US accreditation. Canada has a particular situation where there is no regional accreditation within Canada. It's by virtue of getting one's mandate from government that one is accredited, if you will. But as in distance learning, the question is always who are you accredited by? The further you go from home, the more pertinent that question is. And so one of our key strategies, and one of my roles as a CEO, was to work over the 10-year period to become the first and only Canadian university that gained US accreditation.
So given this, what would you say were the most important lessons that you had learned from your role as president?
The most important lesson, if I had to pick one, would be that open distance learning at the turn of the century has become a service industry, and that there are no longer any captive audiences, whereas in previous years or previous decades there were, because there were so few providers. But in the 21st century, there are no captive audiences, and there are few geographic stakeholders, whether they be political, regional, or even student. They don't give their allegiance to an organization in the way that face-to-face students do. And to be successful in open distance learning, if it's about service, one has to focus not just on quality of the academic programs and services, but on the support services and on flexibility for learners. This is the most important consideration that an organization that wants to succeed in open distance learning has to engage in, that it is about being a provider within a service industry. And if you're a provider within a service industry, you have to be able to organize your university in a way that its culture develops around service, and the work that is performed is organized about providing service. And there's an inherent contradiction or tension between developing a service industry and the normal university culture. Normal universities don't think about themselves as being part of the service industry. And these contradictions are primarily so because academic culture is professor-centered rather than being student-centered. The first allegiance of an academic normally is to his or her discipline, not to the institution, not to the student. Traditional organizations have structures and reward systems that reflect this professor-centric model, and it's critical for it to be successful in the service industry to turn that around. So the challenge of developing different cultures and organizational models for an academic institution can be very difficult, but they're not insurmountable, because a single-mode open distance learning institution has the advantage of only having to organize itself and develop a culture to serve students in open and distance learning. We don't have to provide the same services to face-to-face students. And I firmly believe that if an open and distance learning organization can't compete with a dual-mode institution in distance education, then it has no reason for existing. Interestingly, during the first part of my career, the challenge was justifying what we did as the open and distance educators. Today, the challenge is doing it better quality, more cost effectively than other institutions. And I always argue that's a much easier challenge than justifying what you have to do. But you also have to recognize in your organizational structures that are going to deliver this, that quality and learner flexibility are moving targets. What satisfies the students of today do not satisfy the students of tomorrow, and one need only look at the different attitudes that learners have to distance learning when it's provided through print and telephone versus when it's online. But the organization has to be able to respond to the online, and have to be able to shift its emphasis and its culture. And who knows what the needs will be 10 years from now as new technologies come in. So it means that in order to sustain a successful open distance learning institution, you require organizational structures and financial models not only that are successful today, but that are easily adaptable to tomorrow's unforeseeable needs. Not an easy task for a university. Even open and distance learning institutions become traditional very rapidly. I think of Athabasca University. Athabasca University in 1995 was a very traditional distance learning provider, and to transform that into an institution where quality was essential and which was going to be increasingly online was not something that was easily accepted. And so a lot of effort had to go into that. And just on the service issue, for example, I firmly believe that the way in which I responded to service as president, to the staff, to people who were working with me, together we were trying to make changes, was critical. It was a message that was being given. So the development of service standards, which was very clear, dealt with all aspects of the organization. And last, the important lesson I would say is that increasing enrollment is an essential strategy for open and distance learning. Not only because financially it's critical to gain those economies of scale, but by serving more students at a reduced rate, you are adding tremendous value to what politicians and other stakeholders and bureaucrats want to see. And of course, as I've argued, the service culture is an essential component of increasing enrollment.
From your experience, what would you say are the common mistakes that institutions make when they introduce distance learning?
I think there are two general categories of mistakes. The first one is often not referred to, but I think it's an essential one, and that's the governance level mistakes that may occur. And the first governance mistake is the hiring of a CEO or president whose values, strengths, and interests don't match the needs of the organization at that particular time. In my experience in Canada, in particular, this has been the case more often than one would have hoped. At my own institution at Athabasca, for example, there have been 6 presidents to date, and of the 6, 2 would certainly fall into this category with our review in history of the performance of the organization. And a third one would actually fall into that category too when it comes to reappointment. In other words, he was, in my judgment, and there's many other people, he was a very good first-term president, but he ought not to have been there for 2 terms. There's a sister institution in the province, in Canada, that experienced this and ultimately led to its demise. It no longer exists because the wrong president was picked at the wrong time. So at the board level, at the governance level, I would emphasize that this is a fairly common mistake. The other mistake, which is linked to this at the board level, is allowing a board to be so far removed and ill-informed about the organization that they fail to recognize what is needed by the organization, or whether the leadership that's being provided is actually good leadership. Very few boards or chairmen of boards say about their CEO say or believe that he or she is inadequate. There's a distancing of the functions, which of course the CEO encourages, and I encourage in my own way, because we don't want boards that meddle. But on the other hand, you want boards that are well informed as an organization when it's time to make such a significant decisions as whom to appoint or whether to reappoint. I can think of one Canadian example of another institution where a president was appointed who was a very poor match for the organization, but the board was uncharacteristically very well informed of what was happening and was able to step in relatively quickly and to correct that. But in other cases, that doesn't happen. Common mistakes at the institutional level are much more frequent, of course, but in highlighting the most important ones, I would emphasize first and foremost the neglection of government relations. Open and distance learning institutions are very different from what politicians and bureaucrats deal with on a day-to-day basis. And leaders academic leaders have to invest time in working with government and with politicians so that they better understand how an organization, or how the organization works, functions, and how it should be assessed, because very often the criteria that they use to assess traditional universities ought not to apply to a traditional university. Traditional funding formula as well are problematic for open distance learning institutions because they focus on infrastructure, which is infrastructure of a very different kind than what we require. And it seems to me that it's critical that presidents, CEOs invest their time in developing relationships with government and with politicians where our business is better understood and better recognized. Poor or inadequate government relationships have led to significant problems in all three of Canada's open learning universities, to the point that one was almost closed, my own in '95, one was closed and was appended to another institution in the early 2000s, and the third was appended to a traditional university. So government relations are essential. There's very seldom in the Canadian context a political raison d'etre for open and distance learning. It doesn't form part of public policy. It comes in through the back door. And that's the difference between Canadian ODL and open and distance learning throughout most of the world, where there's a national agenda around open and distance learning. That's just not the case. So we have to spend much more time with government and with officials.
What advice would you hand on to institutional leaders about distance learning?
I think the key question that they have to be able to answer satisfactorily is the reason why they want to engage in open and distance learning. How does it fit into the culture of your organization? Why are you doing it? And whether or not there is the will within the organization to engage in what is a very different form of teaching and learning. With globalization, you won't be successful in distance learning if you're not adding a very clear value. So what value do you believe that you're entering into the open distance learning market? What value are you adding? If you can't answer that question, you will not be able to, I suspect you will not be able to develop good systems, and you will not be able to recruit and retain, more importantly, students. Another piece of advice that I think is fairly important is that the distance learning component of an organization, or the whole organization in the case of an open distance learning institution, is constantly at risk. You can't develop a structure and a financial investment and a staffing complement without recognizing that it is constantly going to have to change as the needs of learners change. There is no local captive audience in distance learning, and you are competing for learners, and you have to ensure that what you provide, what you're adding, is critical to their needs. The third piece of advice is that the venture into open and distance learning won't be successful or won't be sustainable unless you're able to develop an organizational culture and staffing models, product development models that facilitate rather than impede change. This has to be a part of the value system of the organization, and it has to be reflected in reality. Fourth point I would make is that academic content is important, but creating or acquiring it is much less difficult than the quality delivery of content, learning opportunities, and academic and non-academic services to learners. Replacing the professor is the easy part of open and distance learning. Ensuring that quality learning occurs on the basis and on the needs of the learners is much more difficult. The last point that I would like to make is perhaps the most important one, and that is that I firmly believe that to be successful, an open distance learning organization, whether it be single mode or part of a dual mode institution, must have enough of the characteristics that are traditionally associated with universities, such that it be considered academically credible at the institutional level. But it can't have so many of those characteristics, such as a very high and academic-centric model, that to negatively impact the economies and scalability of course development and delivery, the flourishing of a service-focused culture, and continuous innovation. Getting this mixture right, that is, how academic is an open distance learning component or institution going to be, getting this mixture right, both qualitatively and quantitatively, is, I believe, a sine qua non of successful, sustainable open and distance learning.
Dominic, thank you very much for sharing your personal insights and knowledge with us. I know people who watch this video will get a great deal out of it. Few people have had the experience you have had. Many thanks.
It's really a great pleasure. Thank you.